International humanitarian law is one of the most powerful tools the international community has at its disposal to ensure the safety and dignity of people in times of war. It seeks to preserve a measure of humanity with the guiding principle that even in the war there are limits. The basic philosophy for protection of civilians during war is based on the very simple idea that hostilities should take place exclusively between armed forces of the conflicting parties, and war must therefore keep out of the way of civilians, but instead civilian has to be respected in all circumstances. Military operations against civilians are prohibited method of winning the war. It is a basic rule that in order to ensure respect for and protection of all the civilian populations and civilian objects, the parties to the conflict must at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants on the one hand, and civilian object and the military objectives on the other, and accordingly must direct their operations only against military objectives. This principle was first enunciated in the Hague Regulations on War on Land 1907 and reiterated in Additional Protocol 1 of 1977, and now it is crystallized into a customary international humanitarian law. Civilians are all persons who are not members of armed forces of a party to the conflict, and civilian population comprises of all persons who are civilians. Civilian objects are all objects that are not military objectives. Civilians are entitled to the protection of international humanitarian law as long as they are not taking direct part in hostilities. But in the reality of modern warfare, however, increasingly civilians make up the overwhelming majority of the victims of armed conflict. Even though international humanitarian law stipulates that attack should only be directed at combatants and military objectives, and that civilians and civil objects should be respected. Friends, during First World War 1914 to 1918, 10 million armed forces and 50,000 civilians were the casualties of this war. In Second World War 1939 to 1945, the trend is slight change. 26 million armed forces and 24 million civilian population were the casualties of this war, that is Second World War. But during the Korean War, that is 1950 to 1953, 100,000 armed forces and 500,000 civilian population were the casualties of Korean War. But in the case of Vietnam War, the trend is shifted to the one side. It means only 150,000 casualties to the armed forces, 3 million casualties to the civilian population. So this data clearly shows that how civilians are vulnerable in the war. Civilians are the main victim in the modern warfare. So in future war and nuclear war, only victim will be the civilians. Friends, next let us discuss on basic legal regime for protection of civilians during armed conflicts. Civilians in war need to be respected by those into whose hands they have fallen. Basic legal regimes pertaining to protection of civilians during armed conflict are found mainly in Geneva Convention 4, Additional Protocols 1 and 2, and customary laws. Protection of civilians during armed conflict is discussed briefly as follows. The protection of civilian populations against effect of hostilities. Friends, under international humanitarian law, only military objectives may be attacked. Even attacks directed at military objectives are prohibited if the expected incidental effect on the civilian populations are excessive, and even when an attack directed at a military objective is not expected to have excessive effect on civilian populations, all feasible precautionary measures must be taken into minimize those effects. Friends, lawful methods of warfare are not unlimited, that is limited. In particular, international humanitarian law prohibits certain kind of attack, including attack the purpose of which is to terrorize the populations, directed at civilian object, indiscriminate attack, even it is legitimate military objective, and reprisal against civilians or civilian object, and use of civilian population to seal military objectives. Civilian lose their protection against attack if they participate directly in hostilities. To protect the civilian population as a whole or groups of especially vulnerable groups like wounded and sick, the infirm and elderly, children, etc. Safety zone may be set up with the consent of both sides during the conflict. For example, in the form of an open city, or in a time of peace already as demilitarized zone. Such zone may be neither defended against an enemy advance nor attack. Their sole purpose is to guarantee the physical survival of the populations sheltering within them. With the agreement of the parties to the conflict, such zone may be placed under the control of representative of protecting power or of the International Committee on the Red Cross. Friend, next let's discuss on protection of civilians against arbitrary treatments. The bulk of law concerning the protection of civilians against arbitrary treatment is enumerated in Geneva Convention 4. In first place, humanitarian assistance. International humanitarian law recognizes that the civilian population of a state affected by armed conflict is entitled to receive humanitarian assistance, that is in the form of food, medicine, medical equipments or other vital supplies to the civilian in need. During an international armed conflict, belligerents or occupying power in the case of occupied territories and third state not involved in the conflict are obliged to permit relief operations for the benefit of civilians. Impartial humanitarian organizations such as International Committee on the Red Cross are permitted to render relief operation during war. Here, we may also mention the role of civil defense as a way to provide aid to the war victims, particularly civilians. Civil defense means the performance of humanitarian tasks like warning, evacuations, collection of injuries and deaths, first aid, firefighting, the provision of emergency accommodations, emergency repairs, for example, water supply systems, and many others, intended to protect civilian populations against the dangers and to help them to recover from the immediate effect of hostilities or disaster, and also to provide conditions necessary for its survival. Civil defense organizations are purely civilian in character and they are subordinated to the civilian authorities, and as civilian organization they are fully protected. They are identified by a special emblem, a blue triangle on an orange ground. Friends, starvation as a method of warfare against the civilian is prohibited form of warfare. In the second place, special protection of certain categories of persons. International humanitarian law accorded special protection to the women, children and civilian journalists. International humanitarian law protect women, either civilian or combatants, if they are wounded, sick or shipwrecked as civilians, according to their status, as the same protection as that is given to the man without any adverse distinctions. Women are more vulnerable during war, so international humanitarian law gives them preferential treatment in some particular cases. Women are especially protected against any attack on their sexual integrity, in particular against rape, enforced prostitution or any form of indecent assault. Pregnant women and maternity cases are especially protected against the effect of war and during occupations. Female prisoner of wars or female civilian internees also benefit from these special rules. Like women, children are also protected by international humanitarian law if they are wounded, sick or shipwrecked as civilians and as member of civilian population. They also benefit from special protection because of their vulnerability. Every armed conflict leaves numerous children without resources or separated from their families, a situation that renders them even more vulnerable. International humanitarian law provides special protections and respect for civilian journalists engaged in professional missions in area of armed conflict, as long as they are not taking a direct part in hostilities. Regarding the protection of journalists engaged in dangerous professional missions, that is working in a theater of war, are to be considered as civilian in every respect, and they are therefore entitled to the protection normally due to civilians. If they expose themselves to unusual dangers, then they must accept the consequences. Friends, we all know the role played by war correspondents, for instance, in highlighting grave breaches of international humanitarian law in civil war in Sri Lanka, Afghanistan and Syria. Friends, let us discuss on rules on protect the civilian and internees. When war breaks out between two states, national or one of them may, for a number of reasons, be on the territory of other states. The Geneva Convention 4 regulates the situation of such persons who were previously often without any legal protections. As part of conventions, they are now protected persons. They are allowed to live, and who remain there must be treated in accordance with the legislation applying to foreign nationals in the peacetime, that is law on aliens. The authority must guarantee the minimum protection stipulated in human rights treaties. Accordingly, such person must be enabled to have paid employment, receive aid parcels and medical care, etc. Human treatment must be accorded, and forced labor and collective punishment are explicitly prohibited. In addition, the protecting power and International Committee on the Red Cross are allowed to visit. Protected persons may, of course, be transferred to their own country at any time and must be repatriated at the latest at the end of the hostilities. Friends, let us discuss on protection of refugees and displaced persons under international humanitarian law. Wars always bring the problems of refugees and internally displaced persons. ISL also address such situations and forced movement of civilians during non-international armed conflict and in occupied territories are accordingly prohibited. Displaced persons are civilians fleeing within their own country, for example, from armed conflict. International humanitarian law protect those displaced because of an international armed conflict. For example, grant them right to receive items essential to survival. Civilians displaced by internal armed conflict enjoy similar but less developed protection in common Article 3 to the 4 Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 2. Refugees, in contrast, are those who fled their country. International humanitarian law protect such individuals as civilians affected by hostilities. Regarding non-refoulements, international humanitarian law expressly states that protected person may not be transferred to a state where they fear persecutions on political or religious ground. Next, we will discuss on special rules on occupied territories. From the point of view of international humanitarian law, civilians in occupied territories deserve and need particular detailed protecting rules. Living on their own territory, they come into contact with enemy independently of their will, merely because of armed conflict, in which the enemy obtain territorial control over the place where they lived. The civilians have no obligation toward occupying power other than the obligation inherent in their civilian status, that is, not to participate in hostilities. Because of that obligations, international humanitarian law allowed them neither to violently resist occupation of their territory by the enemy, nor to try to liberate the territory by violent means. Rules on occupied territories are partly governed by Hague Regulations of 1907 and partly by Geneva Convention 4 and relevant provisions of Additional Protocol 1. Friends, now we come to the concluding part of these lectures. In conclusions, the basic principle behind the protection of civilians during armed conflict is, in order to ensure respect for and protection of all civilian populations and civilian objects, the party to the conflict must at all times distinguish between the civilian population and the combatants on one hand, and civilian objects and military objectives on the other, and accordingly must direct their operations only against military objectives. This principle is supplemented by another principles, that is, in any armed conflict, the right of the parties to the conflict to choose method and the means of warfare is not unlimited, that is limited. These principles are now considered as a part of customary international law. The most of the provisions of protection of civilians during armed conflict, whether international or non-international, contained in treaty laws are now acquire status of customary international humanitarian law. Even some are regarded as preemptory norm, that is jus cogens. Therefore, they are binding to all states and party to armed conflict. Apart from these, the universal and regional conventions on human rights must also be observed during wartime, although certain derogations are permitted in exceptional circumstances. They are applicable simultaneously with the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. In this way, comprehensive legal protections of human dignity is ensured in the extreme condition of war. Friends, this is all about how ISL protect unarmed civilians and their objects. Thank you for your patient hearing.